Welcome everybody to today's webinar entitled Understanding, Preventing and Overcoming Musical Inhibition. And it will be presented with my dear friends and fellow researchers, Professor Albi Odendaal, Dr. KATHRYN Ang, as well as myself. Today's webinar is actually a part of the YST Conservatory of Music Learning Curve series. It is also part of the Singapore Music Teachers Association's Coffee Talk sessions. So I'd just like to extend a big thank you to these two institutions for supporting this event. A little bit about my co-presenters. Professor Albi Odendaal is an associate professor in music education in the School of Music at the Northwest University in South Africa. He is also a docent at the Sibelius Academy of the University of the Arts, Helsinki, and an Associate Senior Research Fellow at the Sir Zelman School of Music and Performance at Monash University. His research interests include psychology of music, music education, memory, and music teacher education. Dr. KATHRYN Ang is an extraordinary researcher with the research niche area of Masara, which is part of Northwest University in South Africa as well. She is also a music educator teaching piano, performance, and pedagogy at the diploma, pre-university, and tertiary levels in Malaysia. She's a frequent educator at piano competitions and performs as a collaborative pianist as well. Her research interests include music education, piano didactics, and music teacher education. I am Khoo Hui Ling. I'm very happy to see you here today. I lecture at the YST Conservatory of Music and also founded the music studios in Singapore where I mentor piano teachers as well as students. So it's a funny story how we met. I actually met KATHRYN at the ABRSM Piano Teacher Conference a few years ago, and she introduced me to Professor Albi Odendaal. And together when we conversed, we were really intrigued by the fact that there was a lot of research done on how to nurture musicality, but there was not much research done on what inhibits musicality. And that's why we embarked on this project, because we also observed that inhibition of musicality is something that we observed in our students. So today's webinar is broken into a few sections. We'll start with defining the keywords of our topic. We'll also share with you the methodology behind our research. We will proceed on to share with you our findings, as well as our outlook, and we will end with a question and answer session. So for those who are wondering, this should end by 9:30 p.m. Singapore time or 3:30 p.m. South Africa time. But before we launch straight into our research, we'd like to hear from you. So we do have a little survey prepared for you. And you should be able to see it right now. Okay. Do give me a shout out if it's not working for you, but it should be. All right, you'll see 4 questions here. All right, so just give me a second before I launch into my first one. Okay, so what we did during our research was we interviewed fellow piano teachers, and in order to spur the interview on, we shared with them factional stories, which are actually fictional stories based on real experiences, and that's why factional stories. So I'll be summarizing some of these factional stories for you, and we'd love to hear your experiences or your reactions to them. Okay, so factional story number 1 is a story of Margaret. Margaret is a very motivated adult student, and she's practicing really hard for a piano examination, but her family found the sound of her practicing, especially the repetition, unbearable, and therefore they were not very supportive of her. So if you look at the slide, the dad says to Margaret, "No one asked you to play the piano, let alone take an exam when you already have a proper job. What's the point of it?" So Margaret was feeling very miserable as she could not practice under such conditions. At her next piano lesson, she could not play well as she was traumatized by her father's negative words. So question 1, do you know someone who has, or have you personally encountered a similar scenario? Okay, I'll give 5 seconds for you to respond to that. Okay, and I'll go on to factional story 2. Factional story 2 is a story of a student who was verbally abused by her teacher. So this is what the student said. My last teacher would shout at me and tell me that I am stupid, slow, and untalented. The student described the trauma she had experienced with her last piano teacher who was verbally abusive towards her. And this resulted in a great loss to her self-esteem as well as confidence in playing the piano. She explained that she was in tears because of the fear that was instilled in her. And so we have question number 2. Do you know someone who has experienced this, or have you personally encountered a similar scenario? Factional story 3 is about a teenage student who is very musical. She is extremely motivated, a very fast learner, and with a very nurturing family background. So everything seems to be in place. However, when in front of other people, her expressivity is suppressed. She says, I just can't do it. I can't perform, especially when I know someone is around. And it gets much worse when there are more people listening. I can't pick the sounds I would like to, and it's so frustrating. And she concludes that maybe I'm just not made to perform. So again, a little show of hands, who has experienced this or who has heard of stories that are similar? Okay. A little bit of confession. Actually, I think I used to be such a student myself. And it took quite a lot of effort to overcome that. All right, wonderful. Good to know that I am not alone here. Okay, and so we go on to factional story 4. Okay, factional story 4 is about a young student, YKit. His parents want him to take a piano graded examination before he is ready for it. And despite the teacher's advice against it, the parent believes that the examination certificate will boost the child's chances of getting into a good secondary school. So here you see on the slide, the teacher explains, I can try, but YKit may not have the musical maturity to take the exam yet. Pushing him to do so when he is not ready to may affect his interest and self-confidence in music. So what happened in the end was that the student's expressivity in music was killed through the drilling that the teacher had to resort to in order to get him up to place. In the end, the student and parents concluded that YKit was simply not talented in music based on his examination results and therefore stopped his music lessons. So again, a show of hands, who has experienced this? I see very active Dorothy is always the first one to raise hand. Wonderful. Okay. So yes, seeing quite a few hands. Okay. All right. So it seems that everybody actually has some sort of experience with the 4 factional stories mentioned. All these stories reflect musical inhibition exhibited in different ways and caused by different factors. So, I think it shows that all of us in some way or another we have come into contact with musical inhibition. And so I hoped what we proceed to share with you will be insightful tonight. Perhaps let us first begin with defining the key terms of our topic. What is musicality and what is inhibition? So I'll hand it over to KATHRYN from here.
Thank you, Hui Ling. Well, let's start off with what is musicality. We began our study by reviewing literature on musicality, and we understand musicality to be a concept that can appear in many forms and have a variety of characteristics. It involves the whole person. It includes behavioral, social, and cognitive aspects. So these cognitive and biological factors, together with environmental factors, such as the surrounding musical cultures, they contribute to the development of musicality. Musicality can also present as an ability that is both receptive, next slide please, in the sense of listening to and appreciating music, and also productive in the sense of creating music using different means. Musicians often understand musicality also more narrowly as a level of expressivity in the performance of music. For example, in the next slide, Gabrielson claims that the expression of emotions is a crucial part of musicianship and of musicality in general. So we understand musicality to be widely distributed in the population. It's already evident in the womb, and it is manifested through all phases of life. It manifests in various kinds of expressions such as oral ability, listening, dancing, singing or playing instruments, memorization, improvisation, as well as composing, arranging, or producing music. So in addition to reviewing literature on musicality, we discussed the concept of musicality with teachers to learn more about their perspectives on it. And the teachers we found presented a varied and complex picture of musicality. So we have grouped their responses into 6 categories, as you'll see in the next slide, which are feeling, facility, originality, oral perception, thought, and movement. These categories provide an overview of the range of the various perspectives that teachers have on the concept of musicality. So first of all, let us look at musicality as feeling. Next slide. A teacher described musicality as having an emotional connection with the music, while another said that it is feeling the music. Musical children in general enjoy their musical engagement because they really love what they're playing. Furthermore, musical children can also express some of this emotional connection instinctively, simply by knowing what to do and when to do it. For the musicality as facility, teachers link several technical abilities or skills with being musical, such as playing by ear, reading well, singing, improvising, composing, and transposing. Next, we have musicality as originality. Some teachers describe musicality as having imagination. One called this thinking beyond the notes, and another being creative. A teacher claimed that musicality is expressed spontaneously and without coaching. So such spontaneity results in playing that's fresh and sincere. We now look at musicality as oral perception. Spontaneity rests upon being perceptive and being sensitive to sound, according to a teacher. Another teacher claimed that musical children pay attention to nuances of phrasing and dynamics by shaping the music, phrasing beautifully, and singing through their instruments. Next, we have musicality as thought. A teacher referred to musical children as being more alert, more bright, including that they have a strong interest in music. Another teacher thought that they learn music quicker and in a more natural way. Musical children respond readily to the teacher's prompting and instruction. They understand music easily and they express that understanding to the audience. And the last category is musicality as movement. A teacher described someone who is musical as being able to flow and have fluency. For another teacher, this is expressed in a natural sense of rhythm. Physical movement is allied to a sense of flow, and therefore musical children move naturally. They are usually unable to sit still and have to express their experience of music in movement. So these musicality descriptions provide a synthesis of musicality understandings. Within the larger picture, each teacher had their own emphasis, with some leaning more towards an understanding of musicality being innate or natural, while others felt that musicality can be learned. We also discovered that teachers' descriptions of musicality tend to focus on visible or audible pupil actions. As a result, the teachers in this study provided only a partial picture of musicality when viewed in the context of research literature, but they all agreed that such musicality could be inhibited. On that note, I now pass the time back to Hui Ling.
Thank you, KATHRYN. So the next important keyword in our topic is inhibition. So I'm going to explain what inhibition is. There are 3 commonly discussed kinds of inhibition. There's behavioral inhibition, cognitive inhibition, and social inhibition. Behavioral inhibition is defined as an inborn bias to respond to unfamiliar events by showing anxiety. It's the kind of vulnerability that we have when encountering unfamiliar events that cannot be processed easily. And we can easily see this in many children. Cognitive inhibition is the overriding of an existing mental process, whether intentionally or not. And social inhibition is the suppression of emotional expression or behavior during social interactions in order to gain approval. What you notice is that in all three manifestations of inhibition, there consists of a limitation or incapacity to freely express a wish or natural ability. Now, inhibition could stem from several causes. Behavioral inhibition is often understood as being biologically based. In other words, inborn, you're born with it. However, inhibition could also be due to environmental factors. For example, causes of social inhibition may be affected by parental beliefs, parent-child relationships, and extrafamilial relationships, the relationships or friendships that we have around us. Experiences can also affect inhibition. Fear and anxiety symptoms can be acquired through a direct traumatic experience, the transmission of verbal information, and even through vicarious or observational learning. If you remember from earlier, KATHRYN mentioned that musicality is shaped through the same three factors you see here: biological, environmental, and experiential. Yet these three same aspects also affect inhibition, which makes me wonder, perhaps musicality and inhibition might just be on the opposite ends of a spectrum. Food for thought there. So in this presentation, the inhibition of musicality is broadly conceived as the limiting of potential musical behaviors, thoughts, or interactions of a child due to the above three causes that you see here on the screen. I'll now hand it over to Albi, who will share with you the motivation and methodology behind our research.
Thank you, Hui Ling. So what Hui Ling has already described is that what we saw and what we noticed in the Malaysian and Singaporean context is that there is an abuse of the examination system by parents and by teachers, and that this abuse takes several forms, but people focusing on the result or focusing on the certification rather than on the experience of growing as a musician. And what we noticed is that in this, students are poorly developed, or their musicality is poorly developed, or in fact, sometimes even actively inhibited. And so we were wondering, how could we understand this feature better? You can go to the next slide, please. So we formulated our research question, and we wanted to know in which ways 12 private studio teachers in Singapore and in the Klang Valley of West Malaysia understand and cope with the inhibition of musicality in their students. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in order to identify people that wanted to take part, or that we wanted to take part in this study, we searched for music teachers both in Singapore and in the Klang Valley or around Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And we purposefully sampled teachers, meaning that we directly approached people that we thought would be good respondents, people that we thought would provide interesting information for us or data for us to analyze. And we looked for people who have a range of genres and also a range of experience. And so we have participants who teach in the Western classical, and we have participants who teach in jazz or more popular styles, or who combine the styles in various ways. We tried to make sure that the people that we spoke to were well spread across these genres, and also in terms of their experiences. Many of the teachers that we spoke to were very well experienced. They had at least more than 10 years of experience as music teachers. Hui Ling has already introduced you to our factional stories, 4 stories that we presented to our participants and the stories were intended to kind of provoke people, like we tried to provoke you a little bit into a reaction, either of, yes, this is familiar to me, or no, this is not familiar to me, and then to kind of get a discussion going around people's stories, people's experiences with these various factors. So we used the literature to identify 4 causes of musical inhibition that we thought were pertinent: parental disinterest, abusive teaching, the personality of the student themselves, and also pressure from the parents. And then we had an interview and a discussion with these 12 music teachers about how they understood these things, how they coped with them, and trying to understand how people thought, how the participants thought about these various issues surrounding inhibition of musicality. We transcribed all of these interviews, of course, and then we coded them together. So we're using an online collaborative coding process. And what we kind of came up with is that this model that you see depicted here, that the student, who is the little blue block there, is in an environment, of course, as you all know, where teachers and parents play a pivotal role in their development. And another factor that's very important there are the examinations. And what we saw from our data is that each of these role players or factors can be positive or negative. They can either help the student by supporting them, by supporting their autonomy, by helping them to become more musical, or they can be negative, either through harsh teaching, what we have called MTOUGH teaching, which is an acronym that we devised from the way that our participants spoke about this kind of teaching: militaristic, threatening, abusive, and fierce teaching. Hui Ling will talk a little bit more about that later. But so each of these role players either have a positive or a negative impact, either through increasing anxiety or increasing inhibition or increasing musicality and freedom of musical expression. We are going to now go into discussing our findings a little bit. So we found 3 broad themes that we want to discuss. One of them, KATHRYN's already discussed, is musicality and how our teachers view musicality and understand musicality. And so what we're going to discuss next is inhibition of musicality. And we're going to look at parental pressure as one feature of this inhibition. We're going to look at examinations as another feature of this inhibition. And we're going to look at this idea of MTOUGH teaching as another feature of inhibition of musicality. So I'm going to hand over to KATHRYN to talk about parental pressure.
Thank you, Albi. Yes, I'll now talk about how musicality can be inhibited through parental pressure. The teachers we interviewed described how the parents had inhibited aspects of their children's musical development, mainly by creating a pressured environment. This was the result of setting overly high expectations, comparing their children to other children, and also being overly controlling. So first, let's look at parents who set overly high expectations for their children. Vladimir was strongly opposed to parents who are not in line with what our motto or our views are in music. Tiffany was stressed out by parents telling her what they wanted their child to have in order to achieve their dreams. So both Tiffany and Vladimir were convinced that parents' expectations were misaligned with their approach to teaching. Most of the teachers we spoke to spoke of managing aggressive parents' expectations, which were often unrealistic. For instance, Leon was exasperated with parents who had expectations that their children's examinations should be completed within a very short time frame. He described that there are even parents who asked for their children's first exam with him after 1 month of studying lessons. Further, Kasha bemoaned the fact that some parents believe that the grade level at which their children are at school should be the same level at which they complete music examinations. And she has totally no idea how they came up with that. Second, we look at parents who compare their children to other children. Vladimir described a student who was musically inhibited because the parents were comparing her abilities to those of other students. He said that he would never compare any of the students he had because they had their own different abilities. Whereas Gordon believed that such parents were compensating for what they didn't have, and they wanted their kids to do that. As a result, the parents were comparing their own life experiences to those of their children, expecting their children to achieve more than they had themselves. And thirdly, we consider parents who are being overly controlling. Parents who do not consider their children's needs or the nature of the teaching situation continue to put pressure on the children to achieve beyond their current skill levels. And the teachers are also affected because they're expected to make it happen. And Kasia felt that parents don't care about whether the children can play well, make good music, enjoy playing the piano, or even making music with their friends. What they're looking for is a cert. This is a sad and unfortunate situation, but while many teachers were in principle opposed to such parenting approaches, they were all aware of several instances where parents got their way at the expense of their children's musical development. Now I'll turn the floor over to Albi to share our findings on how musicality can be inhibited by examinations.
The quote on the screen here reflects one participant's summary of this issue, saying that children's music learning experiences were no longer a musical journey or a performance arts journey. It's really a paper chase, and the system perpetuates that. And there are kind of three ideas in this quote that I would like to highlight. The first is the perception of the purpose of examination, and there's this conflict of what examinations are for. And teachers acknowledge that the purpose of examination or people's perceptions of the purpose of examination were not necessarily just individual decisions of, we're going to do this paper chase, but happen in the context of a certain kind of society, which in a way traps both the teacher and the parent, and that then creates expectations which lead the parents to put pressure on their children to take these exams or to excel at these exams, having negative then effects on the life of the children. The second idea here is that the idea of a paper chase, and that parents or teachers view these examinations as just kind of another academic subject on the one hand, or as just something that has to be done, but where musicality is not encouraged, musicality is not strengthened in any way, because it's very driven towards objectives. It's not enough time to really learn the pieces. It's not enough time to really express what you want to express. Students are forced to just kind of try and finish their exams. So it becomes a paper chase rather than a musical journey. And the last idea is this idea of the system. So what I've learned, I don't know the Singaporean context well, but Hui Ling tells me that in order to get into a good secondary school, it's often advantageous to have a high pass rate or a high grade certificate, and it's such that students get put pressure on. In order to be able to access these good schools, they try and get as high certificate as they can get. In some cases, students even having to pass a grade 8 exam before they enter into high school. So these kind of three ideas of the perceptions and the paper chase and the system are really underpinning the examinations, causing problems with the development of musicality in the students. I'm going to hand over to Hui Ling to talk about teaching in this context.
Thank you, Albi. I'll just take a little bit of a detour here to just let everybody know that the names that you're seeing, Vladimir, Tiffany, so on and so forth, they are actually names that we gave the teachers that we interviewed so as to protect their identity. But a little fun fact is that we named all our teachers after famous pianists. So if you're feeling bogged down by the very heavy topic of inhibition, you might want to take a fun break of guessing who these pianists are. But if not, I'll get back to the topic, and I'm really going to talk about how MTAF teaching is a product of, or rather can cause inhibition of musicality. So as Albi mentioned just now, MTAF stands for militaristic, threatening, abusive, and fierce. And these were a collection of descriptors that teachers used to describe a certain approach to teaching that impacted musicality negatively. Ironically, it also sounds like I am tough. This kind of teaching was described as leading to trauma, loss of interest, confidence, loss of confidence as well, and a poor musical foundation. So let's talk about trauma first. Trauma can result from MTAF teaching, and trauma embodies itself in psychological stress as well as physical tension. So over here, teacher Emma shared an experience with a transfer student whose previous teacher was abusive. The previous teacher would beat her arm and tap her back very hard whenever she played wrongly. Emma noticed long-lasting negative effects, saying that every time she played wrongly, she would get a bit of tension. She would then go all out to apologize. I've also noted in my own personal teaching that there are quite a number of students who often say sorry, and they often apologize before they perform. So, I've also come to realize that this may not be due to abusive teaching, but it is a strong indicator of inhibition being present in a student, as it points to a certain fear of making mistakes. Now, the resultant trauma of MTAF teaching causes a loss of interest in music. Emma told of another transfer student whose previous teacher splashed water on her when mistakes were made. The student was still able to play well, but the student said that they hated piano and hated practicing. Eventually, this pattern could lead to a student stopping music, as another teacher, Teacher Alice, observes. She says that amongst her peers who had MTAF teachers, she says that they swear that they will never touch music again, and then they sell the piano and they throw away all their music books. So MTAF teaching does indeed lead to a loss of interest in music. MTAF teaching also leads to a very low self-esteem. We've talked about physical abuse in the past two examples, but abuse may also be verbal as well as physical. Teacher Yuja, who admits that her teaching traumatized students in her earlier years due to her harsh words and first personality, shared that parents had reported that their children's self-esteem took a dip. She reflects that whenever a student plays, I will criticize because I want to make it better. And she says that she should have been more encouraging instead of, zooming into the parts that she wanted to fix immediately. The student probably felt that whatever she did was not good and therefore became less confident. MTAF teaching also leads to a poor musical foundation because normally an incompetent teacher may unknowingly tend towards MTAF teaching to make up for the inability to give sound advice. And this would result in a poor musical foundation for the student. So teacher Nadia here recalls a personal experience. She says that when she was studying, the teacher gave no explanation on dynamics, the composer, or the style whatsoever. Nothing was introduced. Instead, the teacher was leisurely talking with anyone who was around, and the student was left all by herself. And if you made a mistake, or if you have a question, she would scold you. She would scold the student. And so from this example, you can see how the teacher's incompetency may actually result in MTAF teaching, which then results in a poor musical foundation for the student. It is important to note that while MTAF teaching mostly impacts negatively on students, some of the interviewees did note that MTAF teaching could lead to progress. So teacher Emma said that she knew of students who have gone through militaristic teaching, but have actually been very successful. And teacher Gordon also states that students actually did learn, and some did progress a lot under MTAF teaching. But regardless, what you can tell so far from our findings is that to a large extent, the different facets of parental pressure, perceptions of the purpose of the examinations, and the effects of MTAF teaching all cause a variety of symptoms in students, symptoms that point towards musical inhibition. So before we venture into the next segment, which deals with the prevention of and overcoming of musical inhibition, we'd like to hear from you, your experiences, whether you are a parent, teacher, or student. So what we do right now is to invite you to join a breakout room. All right, Albi's breakout room will be focusing on examinations. KATHRYN's breakout room will be focusing on the topic of parental pressure. And in my breakout room, we'll be talking a bit more on MTAF teaching. All right, so I thought maybe we could have a little short recap from each room, the discussion that went around. Albi, do you want to start first?
I will, yes. We had a really interesting discussion about examinations. A nuanced one, I think, because we said that it's very individual whether the exams add pressure and whether that pressure is negative for the child. Some children flourish under that kind of pressure and they need that kind of goal-directed activity in order to progress, whereas other children, that kind of pressure is very negative. But when we spoke about our own experiences with exams, it was usually a negative experience. The participants in our group didn't like taking exams and didn't enjoy the process, and in one case even led to them not playing for themselves for a while. Negative thing. But another interesting thing that came up was the idea of the generational differences between parents, that parents of previous generations were much stricter and put much more pressure on students than modern parents who are more relaxed. And so that was another interesting facet, because I know that we also found that with teachers, there was also somewhat of a generational difference with the older generation and the younger generations. So a really interesting discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Maybe I'll jump in here before we move to KATHRYN, because the discussion in my room had actually similarities with that, in the sense that it was nuanced. We had parents and teachers in the breakout room, and we were talking about MTAF teaching, and it was always interesting to hear a perspective from a parent. And what the parent mentioned was that MTAF teaching was, it can be tricky. One can't immediately just say that it's bad. Of course, in extreme cases, it's bad. But what really struck me was that the parent mentioned that at the end of the day, parent, student, and teacher must be in line with the expectations of the outcome of the musical education and where the education is headed. There must be a sense of trust. And then the kind of teaching that ensues, the right level of pressure, the right level of strictness can then follow. So it sometimes can be a bit tricky to determine that. Yeah. We also talked about, I also posed a question to the existing two teachers in the breakout room on what they would do if they faced students who were musically inhibited. And I think the two main points that came out was to give students a choice of what to play and how to direct music lessons. And another teacher said it was really important to create a safe environment, whether through singing, through games, through movement, so that they can help the child overcome their fear and open up to the teacher. Yeah. So on to you, KATHRYN.
Okay, on that note, Hui Ling, we had a mixture of teachers and parents. I had a very interesting parent who is both a parent and a teacher. And she clearly claimed that she's a tiger mom. And she had all actually gone through the experience of having to push her child, really, really hard in order for her to enter into a prestigious establishment. At the same time, she said over that period, it was a difficult time. And she said, well, there's no pain, no gain. So it was a painful experience, but the good thing that came out of that was her child did get into this DFA program, I believe. And when she was there, she's now actually flourishing and she's doing really well. And she's growing and developing at her own pace. So she said that push was necessary at the very beginning, but she's seeing her daughter flourish. At the same time, some of the other teachers that were in the group, someone said they also had a very similar experience to YKids parents. We're looking at Factional Story 4 in our group. And she has found that you really need to have a good relationship between the parent and the teacher in order for the parent to be able to understand and also flow along and cooperate with the teacher's advice. She says a good rapport is really necessary, and they need to have this kind of communication. Otherwise, you will end up with the same kind of problem as in YKids' case. And also the other thing was that the main problem is parenting issues, where a lot of parents are just on a paper chase and are always comparing their children to other people's children. So I think on that note, we also had a really interesting discussion. I wish we had more time, but it was a good discussion.
Thank you, KATHRYN. We definitely have more time later where there's a Q&A. And although the questions are actually supposed to be posed towards us, I believe we can also ask questions. So that's coming up next. All right, but for now, let's move on with our presentation. The final part of our presentation will be talking about preventing and overcoming musical inhibition. And I'll let KATHRYN start us off on what parents can do to prevent and overcome musical inhibition.
Yeah, when we were thinking about how parents can prevent musical inhibition in their children, we realized that this may be related to the motivation for parents wanting their children to study music. One of the things that came up was, firstly, parents, they should avoid giving their children too much pressure to achieve good results in examinations. I think this kind of pressure can actually cause the inhibition, and if we avoid giving that kind of pressure, it can diminish musical inhibition, and it might even nurture musicality in the students. It will also promote better enjoyment of music and a more positive learning experience for their children. A second thing we thought about was parents should avoid comparison and competition between their children and the children of other parents. And that also came up in the breakout room where we were just now. And this is the same point, actually. We understand the reason for this is because it stems from a culture of honor and face. Yes, honor and face. And where face is actually very important in gaining the admiration of others by making one's successes or abilities known to them. Therefore, examination results and certificates have become very highly priced as goals, rather than as moments in a journey towards musical maturity. So parents should really encourage their children to enjoy the journey rather than to endure it. So thirdly, parents should avoid putting pressure on their children to perform well in examinations in order to meet the high stakes entry requirements to prestigious secondary schools. I mean, we were just discussing that in the breakout room, and truly, those parents who are wholeheartedly supporting this actually end up putting pressure on their children to achieve what are sometimes known as unrealistic goals, and these goals are misaligned with the teachers. However, having spoken to parent and teacher in the breakout room, I have now also seen that it's possible for there to be a positive outcome from putting pressure on their children in this way. The case of the lady who was sharing. Now, we've also looked at we have already looked at the prevention of musical inhibition, and we'd like to consider now how parents can help their children to overcome musical inhibition. So, not to the next slide, please, Huni. So parents can help their children overcome their musical inhibition by supporting autonomy in their children. And this can be achieved by being less pressuring and more encouraging. Emma, one of the teachers, said that parents play a very important role in building the child's musicality, encourage them more and to help them along. Alice emphasized the importance of parental encouragement in fostering resilience. She believed that if the family and friends are more encouraging, it will be easier for the parents, for the students to go on. She also added that it's very important for us as educators and parents to make the student a strong person, to have a stronger heart to take criticism, whether it's constructive or just mean criticism. And secondly, parents can provide a learning environment that fosters self-determination, modeled through positive learning behaviors. On to the next slide. Leon believed that most of the time the student comes because the parent is the one who is interested, more than the child sometimes. I think many of us as teachers find this is a common issue. Students come largely because their parents want them to get through a certain exam, and that is what they go through. And so we end up, as teachers having to manage this situation. But for Leon, he shared his personal experience of starting to learn the piano at the age of 10. His father was actually the one who actually pushed him to play the piano, because his father was a self-taught violinist and guitarist, and he played all kinds of instruments by ear. So the father was someone who loved music very much. And I think that must have rubbed off onto Leon. Yuja described extroverted parents as also being very positive parents. They encourage a lot of the kids to try out a lot of things. And that's why probably the students are also more spontaneous. And in both of these cases, the children's competence was enhanced by encouraging them to keep an open mind and also to experiment with something new. We also found that parents can play a key role in encouraging musicality in their children by building healthy relationships with them. Tiffany believed, and it's on the next slide, that the influence of the parent on the family environment would foster curiosity in their children's learning. She said that parents can create a family environment where they encourage and express what they are thinking. So this example emphasizes the importance of parents cultivating a family environment that fosters their children's confidence and expressivity in music making. And this will encourage musicality in their children. And now I shall pass the time to Albi to talk about how examinations can help to prevent and overcome musical inhibition in students.
So as we spoke about earlier in our discussion, in our breakout room as well, for some students, the exams actually can be a motivating factor. It helps, it provides an opportunity for them to show what they can do. It gives positive feedback to them when they do well, and that some students flourish in that context. Some students, then Fleischer says that when they think that they want to go and take the exam, they will go all the way out, and that translates to them trying to express their musicality as well, because they know that it will help them to do well. Examinations can also be a way that low self-esteem can be countered, actually, as doing well in an exam can boost the confidence of a student. And one teacher that we spoke to achieves this by preparing the student beyond the exam. So developing them musically and technically beyond what the exam's requirements are, and then letting them play an exam that they will find easy, or that they will find manageable in that sense. And so exams don't have to be inhibitive. Exams don't have to be a negative experience. They can be a positive experience if the teacher is able to creatively incorporate the examination requirements into various aspects that enhance musicality for the student. And Gordon said that the question shouldn't be, how can I get 101 rather than 95? The question should be, how can I play Chopin better? Or how can I play Debussy better? And so the goal is the musicality, not the final score. And so we want tests that support the musicality and the musical development of students, where everything that happens in the exam is also supported through the lessons, and that those aspects help to develop the musicality of the child rather than just being a paper chase. Over to you, Hui Ling.
Thank you, Albi. So I'll be talking about what teachers can do to prevent as well as overcome musical inhibition. So teachers we interviewed suggested that they have countered inhibition by strengthening student autonomy, building students' musical competence, and also nurturing a sense of belonging. And let's start with autonomy. We found that many teachers interviewed created student autonomy in learning by giving them a choice of repertoire. This can help shy students step out of their shell, as they are more likely to put in more effort with repertoire that they like and have therefore chosen. So teacher Emma notices that certain pieces they may choose not to play, but the pieces that the students have chosen, they will be disciplined and they will practice. Teachers can also strengthen autonomy by allowing space for the lesson to be led by the students' interests and strengths. So teacher Vladimir helped the traumatized student in this manner, and eventually the student looked forward to seeing music as a fun thing. And for me personally, I will add that sometimes going away from note learning or the conventional mode of teaching standard repertoire can actually help students break out of their shell, especially if they were traumatized. So focusing on things like improvisation, as well as exploring different genres of music can be really refreshing. Teachers further counter inhibition by building students' confidence through competence. Many of the teachers we interviewed achieved this by taking time to develop a strong technical foundation instead of rushing through the learning. Other teachers created safe environments for students to perform for their family and peers before performing for larger crowds. Some also encouraged students to simulate a performance through self-recordings. What I personally feel is lacking, and that one teacher mentioned, is to get students to listen to good recordings and to attend concerts and live performances so that they set an ideal benchmark for themselves. What is essential is that teachers themselves are competent enough to be able to scaffold or sequence the students' progress into achievable goals. So teacher Yuja points out that the students will become overwhelmed, as reflected on the quote on the screen, when there's so many things to look into if it's just a phrase itself. So if it's a piece that's like a couple of 100 bars, it's often overwhelming for them. If it's a shorter piece, they do it very nicely. And then from there, we slowly increase the length. Teacher Yuja emphasizes that it is important to set achievable goals for students this way, because when the students eventually achieve these goals, their confidence grows. And this results in benefits such as motivation for them to practice more. Finally, building a sense of belonging provides security for a student to overcome inhibition. This is nurtured through effective communication with students. So teacher Emma shares that acknowledgement, simple acknowledgement, can grow trust between the teacher and the student, which in turn leads to a stronger sense of belonging. This was seen in a case where her validating a transfer student's experiences of abuse by a former teacher helped the student overcome trauma. Being able to work with each student's unique personality is part of allowing them to feel a sense of belonging and being valued. It was also really interesting that another teacher, Teacher Leon, mentioned that belonging is fostered through making music together. He mentions that playing duets is not so scary because there's another person playing. So if one person makes a mistake, it's not so glaring. It's not like you're alone in everything. And so he likes to get his students to play duets. And this suggests that getting past feelings of being alone can help students feel safe with performing. It can also help students overcome musical inhibition. And so I'll pass it on to Albi to wrap up.
Yeah, so what's really interesting in the discussion that Hui Ling just led, and also in what KATHRYN said, is these three concepts of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. They are central ideas in a theory that is called self-determination theory. And it's really interesting to us that the teachers identified these ideas as ways to help students without necessarily understanding the kind of theoretical ideas of self-determination theory. So self-determination theory says that we have three basic needs. We have a need to feel autonomy. In other words, a need to feel in control. Autonomy is behavior that feels like it's congruent with who you are, that you have a sense of, I want to do this, I will to do this. So we have a need to feel that we have choices in our life, and that is the sense of autonomy. We also have a need to feel competent. So not to have the level of the work that we are doing to be either too easy, where we feel overcompetent, or too hard, where we feel like we can't achieve this thing. And relatedness, which is, I like being with the people that I'm doing this with. So I like my teacher, I like the people that I play with. We get along well, we have this is a safe space for me. And so these three needs, when they are fully met and when they are supported in the child, leads to a sense of intrinsic motivation. And self-determination theory says that when some or all of these needs are not met, so if you are in a situation where you have no autonomy, you don't have any choices about what is going on, you have no competence, it feels like it's overwhelming, and you don't really like the person, what will happen is that instead of having an intrinsic sense of motivation, you will develop an extrinsic sense of motivation. So you'll be motivated by what the teacher wants, or motivated by what the parent wants, rather than by what you want. And so it's interesting to us that the teachers intuitively kind of picked these things. And I think what we want to highlight is that understanding the self-determination theory is really helpful to teachers, because what happened is that in our interviews, some teachers would emphasize one thing or another thing. And I think it's good to have an overview of these concepts and to know that each of these areas is really important to address when we are facing a situation where a student may be inhibited or maybe experiencing pressure. We can, as teachers, help encourage these things, or even as parents, make sure that our children are aware of their choice in matters, that they are aware of how good they are in certain areas, and that they do end up liking the people that they're doing it with. The people who developed self-determination theory are two psychologists, Ryan and Dechi, and they actually wrote a book, which I think is also titled Self-Determination Theory, if you are interested in reading further. And then also there's an article or several articles by Evans, and a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Music Education by Renwick and Reeve, all of which are really helpful overviews of how this theory applies in music education. And I'm sure if you're interested in reading them, we can find a way to get a copy to you if you don't have access yourself. So we think that self-determination theory kind of really wraps up some of the issues that we've been discussing throughout this presentation of inhibition of musicality, which is very often linked to inhibition of motivation. And so getting the child to be motivated helps them to overcome some of the inhibition that they are experiencing. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Hui Ling, and we thank you for being here and listening to our presentation. And it would be lovely to have some questions or some comments from you, but I'm handing over to Hui Ling to manage that.
Thank you, Albi. So yes, indeed, we've come to the end of our webinar today. But I believe that, and I hope that it has sparked off more interesting and insightful thoughts from our participants. And so I'd like to open the floor to any questions that may pop up in your mind. And if it's not possible for you to unmute at this point in time, you can also type them out in the Zoom chat box. I have a question for KATHRYN, actually, if I may just get the ball rolling a bit. And my question to you is because, you are the expert when it comes to parents and music education, and that's why you're handling the whole parental pressure part of our research. My question to you is, do you find that inhibition that may be caused from parental pressure can result in effects that are hard to overcome or hard to reverse in a child, even when later on in life the environment is better for the child. The learning environment is better for the child.
That's a long question, Khoo Ling.
And yeah, probably it's also, a lot of it is based on personal experience.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think from my experience, I was just thinking of a student I taught, and she was truly under a lot of parental pressure. At the age of 12, she did her grade 8, and her mother wanted her to do her first diploma exam within a year, which is the ATCL. So I said no to the mother. I said, can you please give her a break, give her some time to be more mature and then perhaps come back later. So what she didn't listen to what I said. She went to another teacher, and truly enough, her poor daughter went through a really traumatic experience because the teacher was really, really fierce. And after a year of suffering under that kind of teaching, she came back to me, and her mother said that she only wants you to teach. And I said, why? She said, because she's so afraid of her present teacher because of the pressure. So when she came back to me, I ended up teaching her, and she was a totally different person from the time I used to teach her the grade 8. She was so terrified this time. She listened to everything I said. Whereas in the past, she was kind of, quite la-di-da about the whole thing. But this time she was, and I realized she was very, very, very tensed. And that totally gave me the understanding that, what had happened was her whole inhibition, she was so inhibited in the way she played. And it really was something she couldn't get over for a very long time. So I had to, slowly, gradually get her back out of that fear of playing wrong notes, fear of not getting it right, that kind of thing. And eventually, I would say it did have long-lasting effects. Although she did pass the exam and everything else, but it wasn't the same. She was never quite like she was when she had passed the grade 8 exam pretty well. She was still quite positive and confident then. But after that pressure from the parents, the rushing for the exam and not able to do it, she was quite a different performer after that. And I think it's quite sad that she had to undergo such an experience. I don't think she plays the piano anymore now.
Did the person change?
She did change, yes. She was more fearful, and she was not free to express. She only performed under a lot of pressure.
Mm.
Yeah. So that was my experience. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. But the reason why I asked that was because, I personally teach many transfer students as well. And I noticed a recurring trait in some of the students, in many of the students, in that, it's not just about musical performance, it's about their person as well. When I ask a question, and it could be a simple question like, well, what do you like to play? Or what do you like about this piece? The answer I would really appreciate an answer, even if the answer was, I don't like this piece, which is great, at least it's an answer, but there is no answer often. And I could be waiting 2 to 3 minutes in silence for a student who is above the age of 12 to answer me, because they are scared of giving me an answer that should be an opinion, because they feel that there is a right answer to that question. And it's not just one student, but it's across many students who I know are bright students, and it worries me. It worries me to see a lack of personal agency. And it just sparks a lot of questions inside me as a teacher. Yeah.
So how do you as a teacher, and maybe I can open this to the floor, how do you as a teacher allow for personal agency? Or how do you encourage personal agency? What do you think we can do to encourage agency in our students?
Or in our children.
Or in our children.
think a lot of it is also summarized in what we mentioned about in self-determination. But I think going beyond that, it also requires, you know, I often feel that as a teacher, even after trying my best to create a framework for self-determination, it requires buy-in. It requires parental buy-in and requires trust from the student. So it's back to that Suzuki model of that, that triangle. There's a three-way relationship between the teacher, the student, as well as the parent, and all have to be on board there with the approach. And that can be a tricky balance to come to. Yeah.
Yeah, I think trust is an important word, and it's one that you mentioned. There's does the child trust you as an adult to be safe and to be non-judgmental when an answer is offered that might be a little bit out of the box, or does the child fear some kind of retribution or some kind of correction and has to find the right answer? So I think that the issue of trust is really important in this developing of autonomy, developing of agency.
Yeah.
If the child doesn't trust you, they won't open up to you. But if you trust you, then they will.
Or the child may not know who to trust because they can sense that the teacher and the parent are conflicted, which is something I've experienced as well. And it can also be very tricky. Yeah. Are there any questions from the floor? Okay. Well, if not, maybe what we'll do is we can leave our emails in the group chat, and if if you have any questions or any clarifications, please feel free to email any one of us. For me, my email is muskhl@nus.edu.sg, and I've just left it in the chat. KATHRYN and Albi, would you be comfortable leaving your emails in?
Yeah, I just placed mine there, albi.odendaal@nwu.ac.za.
Okay, and I guess with that, we are, still waiting for KATHRYN.
Just a minute.
Okay, and I think with that, we've come to the end of today's webinar, and we're right on the dot. It's 9:29 p.m. Singapore time, 3:29 p.m. South Africa time. I really hope that this has been insightful for everybody. We hope to keep the discussion going. So thank you very much for coming today.